So much for thank you to whoever hit the record button. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening for our conversation with Deshaun Harrison, hosted by Dr. Amy Ongiri. We're so excited to have you here. My name is Uju, and I will support with some facilitation today. Before we keep going, we do want to make sure that folks know that there are two languages available today, English and Spanish. You can select the channel that you want to hear by looking for the globe looking emblem icon on your Zoom screen. It looks like a circle with lines in it, and then you'll see two options, English and Spanish. You'll select the language that you want to hear. We also have ASL interpretation, which you can select there as well. If you need closed captioning, we also have that available. You can select it by enabling closed captioning in your Zoom features. Okay, let's get started. So I know it's been about 3 years for a good number of us using Zoom, but we always like to start with a Zoom tutorial for folks who might be new or need a refresher. So the first thing, again, we have interpretation available today. We have English, Spanish, and ASL. You can click the language that you like to hear or see by clicking the interpretation icon that you see towards the bottom of your screen. If you want to see all the folks in the room, all the panelists at once, you can change to gallery view, which you can see the speakers and interpreters. And then if you have a question or you want to get our attention, hit the Q&A button, which you'll see is like two text message boxes with Q&A labeled underneath here. And then we'll move now into our land and labor acknowledgement, which I will read aloud. So every community owes its existence and strength to generations of ancestors who have contributed to our hopes, dreams, and collective possibilities. Together, their history allows us to leave our own legacy of hope and justice. Our collective history is that of cultural resilience, re-indigenization, adaptability, colonization, settlement, systemic violence, racism, and forced displacement. Acknowledging this truth helps build mutual respect and connection across diverse communities and lived experiences. Just take a moment to pause there. Thank you. All right, so you might be like, who is hosting this event? It is OHEA. OHEA is Oregon Health Equity Alliance. We call OHEA for short. OHEA is a people of color-led collaborative organized to center and uplift the wisdom of our communities of color through racial justice-informed health equity policies and practices as part of the movement to dismantle white supremacy and shift the imbalance of power. And we have all of our OHEA members, our OHEA staff here on the call. So includes myself, Uju, the co-director at OHEA. We also have Esther, is also a co-director at OHEA, Samika, who is the membership and community engagement strategist, and Daisy, who is our policy and advocacy strategist. Our vision at OHEA is to envision a world where people of color are able to lead fulfilling and healthy lives however they choose. And we do this through 3 bodies of work that includes advocacy, where we advocate and support and move racial justice, health equity policies. Convener, where we convene spaces like this to learn and grow around racial justice, health equity. And then our knowledge center, which includes our trainings, tools, curriculum that is designed to uplift and advance racial justice, health equity. Tonight, we will be having a reading and a facilitated Q&A. So we're in the welcome right now. And then we'll move into readings of chapters 3 and 5 of Belly of the Beast by Deshaun Harrison, who we're so excited to have joined here with us today. And then after that, we will move into a facilitated Q&A by the esteemed Dr. Ongiri. So we're also excited to have with us here today. Thank you for being here. And then we'll have a Q&A from the audience. So you'll have time to ask some burning questions that might be sitting with you. And then towards the end, we'll wrap up and close. Some reminders as we continue, use the question function to let us know your needs, questions. We'll keep that monitored throughout the event. Please say your name before speaking so we know who you are. And you heard the record button at the beginning, but this session will be recorded for folks who aren't able to attend. And then take care of yourself. You need a break from the screen. If you need a drink of water, just want to remind and encourage folks to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. All right. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Deshaun Harrison. And I'll read their bio aloud. Deshaun Harrison is a Black trans theorist and storyteller in Atlanta, Georgia. Harrison has risen to national acclaim with the release of their debut title, Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, published in August 2021. Belly of the Beast won the 2022 Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction, and since then, Harrison has been the recipient of Project Hill's Inspire Award and was listed as a Forbes 30 Under 30 media honoree. Harrison lectures on Blackness, fatness, gender, and their intersections. Harrison currently serves as editor-at-large at Scalawag Magazine and is the co-host of the podcast, a very great podcast, Unsolicited Fatties Talk Back. Between the years 2019 and 2021, Harrison served as associate director and later as managing editor of Wear Your Voice magazine. So I can't see you all, but please join me in a round of applause and welcoming Deshaun Harrison.
Thank you so much for that, Uju, and also thank you to everyone who is here and for all of you who invited me to be a part of your conference. I wanted to also just say thank you for the beautiful sort of intro and welcome that you did. I think that was a great modeling of what a lot of folks could be doing and should be doing during these Zoom conferences, because that's just where we are now. So I appreciate the commitment to accessibility. Before I start the readings, I just want to say that I live in Atlanta, Georgia, where right now we are actively fighting against the building of Cop City, or what the city is describing as a $90 million police training facility, wherein they would build homes, schools, other public buildings to practice killing Atlanta citizens. I also want to take the time to acknowledge the lynching of Jordan Neely, who was a Black man, homeless, perceived to be mentally ill in New York, and was lynched just days ago on May 1st, coincidentally on the day of, on May Day, by a 24-year-old white man who is or was a Marine. And I feel the need to start off by acknowledging these two things, particularly because as I talk about, or as we move through this conversation around medicalization, health, and the disenfranchisement of Black fat folks in particular, I think it's also very important to acknowledge both of these instances, or both of these things, as health crises, right? That the state of anti-Blackness is a health crisis, policing is a health crisis, and acknowledging those two things as such are the only ways that we can actually move forward in any of these conversations. So before I start with the reading of chapters 3 and 5, and I know my time is limited, but I think that this is very important. Before I start with that reading, I want to read a little bit of an excerpt from an article published by a dear friend of mine named Laura Witt in Prism, titled "Jordan Neely Was Lynched." I'm just going to read from the bottom of that. They write, "Since Monday, attempts by right-wing and centrist media outlets to frame Neely's last moments as deserving of lynching are rooted in a long history of demonizing Black anger as dangerous and a sign of madness. As Mon and Stephanie wrote in their op-ed for Prism, the criminalization of errant behavior, madness, and neurodivergence is embedded within US settler colonial history. They wrote, this history includes the racialization of mental illness in ways that benefited slavers and settlers, including drapetomania, which was characterized which characterized the desire for enslaved people to run away as mental illness and made up census data from 1840, which exaggerated mental illness among free Black people? What does it say that Neely's anger at his starvation and thirst was perceived as threatening to his executioner? What does it say of the conditions imposed on a Black, unsheltered, starving person, that prison and the conditions of carcerality are preferable to a slow death on the street? Black rage at the country's injustices, oppressions, and despicable conditions is killed, quelled, and watered down by the state and agents most aligned with its settler colonial missions. When runaway, rebellious, enslaved people protested their conditions, they were tortured and lynched. Neely was protesting the conditions of his existence, and a man lynched him for it. These pieces of information, his state-sanctioned, government-fueled, racial capitalist-born poverty, questions about his mental state, his traumatic past, witnesses sharing about their fear of his erratic behavior, are shared almost as if to justify the lynching. But is the state letting you die of hunger, thirst, and lack of shelter not worth yelling about? I wanted to read from that because as someone who is neurodivergent, who has spent time in a psych ward, who is diagnosed with depression and anxiety, right? And who also lectures on Blackness, fatness, queerness, and disabilities, gender rather, and disabilities. I know intimately the struggles of what it means to navigate an anti-Black world that keeps you from any sort of care, including healthcare, in the midst of a health crisis. And so with that, I will start reading from chapter 3 of my book, Belly of the Beast. Chapter 3, Health and the Black Fat. According to the World Health Organization, health is the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. As I interpret it, this means that for one to be healthy, they must not only be non-disabled, but must also be in an environment that allows for them to feel mentally secure, physically safe, and socially well. As such, this means that Black people, especially those of us who exist with multiple marginalized identities, are always already unhealthy because we are always already unsafe. The creation of race through slavery was precisely intended to make Africans with their blackened or stained skin subjects. They became objects to be subjugated, poked and prodded and turned, at least through language and especially through the ways in which they were engaged, into beasts. Said differently, built into the very fabric of modern society, of the world, created by Europeans and sustained by anti-Blackness, is the idea that the Black, which is to name the slave, is but an object and a subject, and therefore has no need for or right to safety or wellness. The slave was and has always been removed from wellness and safety, both through the total subjugation / domination and objectification of their being. In fact, for a race to be constructed, the slave had to exist, and had to exist as the antithesis of health, so that European physicians, anthropologists, and other eugenicists could determine what set the slave apart from, as J.F. Blumenbach called them, the Caucasian. That being the degeneration or the corruption of the slave's body from the Caucasian. For all intents and purposes, Blumenbach helped create race and did so as to differentiate the human from the slave. These scientists based the idea of health on what Africans could and could not withstand, and created health issues based on what Africans would not withstand. Take, for example, Samuel A. Cartwright. In 1851, Cartwright named two illnesses that were exclusively found in Africans. The first of the two was what he called drapetomania, which was a mental illness that caused the slave to run away. The second one was called dysesthesia aethiopica, which was a sort of weakness or lack of work ethic that Africans would develop if they were not enslaved or otherwise in the possession of white enslavers. His suggested treatment for both illnesses was to wash their open wounds, drape their bodies in oil, and beat them with a leather strap and force them to work in the field, specifically when the sun was beaming. These illnesses were specifically about characterizing the Black who dared to believe they were deserving of health, whereby they were deserving of safety and wellness. Cartwright deemed them psychologically abnormal and inept. And this would essentially birth what we now understand to be scientific racism. Medical apartheid, as named by Harriet Washington, is foundational to the creation of race, which is the creation of the Black, which is the creation of the slave. For as long as there is a Black, there is a subject to be experimented on. For as long as there is a subject to be experimented on, health will always already be inaccessible to the slave. And as this is the case, health is a framework in which no Black person can ever comfortably fit. This is especially true for fat Black people. The belly, or fatness, is yet another reason for why the beast, or the Black, can and will never have access to health. In Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, Sabrina Strings masterfully details how fatness on the Black subject's body set the precedent for how fatness will be engaged in the US and the world as a whole. Fatness was once seen as something to aspire to, something that was attractive. The reason for this, however, was because at the time, fatness signified socio-political and economic power. What Strings makes clear in Fearing the Black Body is that it was fatness's alignment with whiteness that really made it attractive to Europeans. When Europeans saw Africans for the first time and saw that their bodies looked like them, but their skin did not, it was then that anti-fatness was established as a coherent ideology. Because fatness had become blackened, it could only ever be impure and beastly. As the slave represented capital and forced labor, fatness could no longer be about status and power, so it became about greed and ungodliness. Strings argues that the fear of fatness and the preference for thinness are principally and historically not about health, but rather they are ways to legitimize race, sex, and class hierarchies. I agree that anti-fatness is not about health, insofar as the systemic bias against fat people is not predicated on a desire to see Black people mentally secure, physically safe, and socially well. However, because that is true, I would also argue that anti-fatness is about health to some extent. For anti-Blackness and anti-fatness to be legitimate, subjugating, and objectifying structures, their existence had to be predicated on a thing unobtainable by Black fat subjects. That thing is health. In other words, to legitimize race, sex, and class statuses, health had a job to do. That job was to ensure that the Black, which is to the fat, was always fixed to be something that Black fat subjects could not be. This leads to the birth of the medical industrial complex, an institution built and sustained by race scientists and eugenicists dedicated to the continued death of Black fat subjects. Said again, To be Black and fat is to always live as dead, and health ensures that. As opposed to one's literal and physical state of being dead, death with a capital D signifies that one, particularly the Black fat, walks as dead, talks as dead, lives and breathes through death. And that one is ontologically always already socially dead. In this way, so-called race scientists and eugenicists used and do still use the Black fat as capital. That is, products on which they build anti-Black and anti-fat structures like health and the medical industrial complex with the intent to maintain a hierarchy, a social world order. String states that race works to repress savage Blackness while also disciplining whiteness. I believe that fatness and health do something similar. Fatness and health, like race, are also double agents. They are all used to tell Black fat people who and what they are, but they are also used to tell white people who they should not want to become. When they fail to model that, it can be deadly for them too. Not in the same way as it is for the Black, but deadly as a result of even unintentionally aligning oneself with what exists as the obverse of whiteness. Health in name and in action has always existed to abuse, to dominate, and to subjugate. The medical industry, the healthcare industry, and the diet industry all exist to maintain a culture intended to discipline those whose bodies refuse to, and for many simply cannot, conform to the standards of health. Modern society enforces exercise as a punishment for this very reason. We are not taught to exercise for the sake of enjoyment, nor are we taught to enjoy our bodies in motion. We are taught, per contra, that we exercise so that we can be healthy, and that health must look opposite of fat. This means that health is punishment, so much so that there are entire camps dedicated to forcing children to exercise for the sake of weight loss. We call them fat and/or boot camps. The entertainment industry has created an entire market built on shaming adults into weight loss through reality television. We call it My 600-Pound Life, The Biggest Loser, and 1,000-Pound Sisters. These industries lead to real psychological harm, physical pain, and death. In 1999, a 14-year-old girl by the name of Gina Score died because of forced exercise and a lack of care around fat children's bodies. Gina, who had been part of a camp run and operated by military veterans, had been tasked with a 2.7-mile run. In the middle of that run, Gina fell on the ground and began gasping for air. Soon after, she began foaming at the mouth and hallucinating. After 4 hours of her instructors laughing at her, while drinking soda no less, and accusing Gina of faking, a doctor came outside and called for an ambulance immediately. Gina's organs had failed, and she had died. In an extreme case like this, many would call what happened to Gina abuse. In fact, many did. Gina's case went on to introduce a national conversation around the mistreatment of youth in boot camps and erected new laws and policies in juvenile correctional facilities. But not only was Gina abused, she was murdered. She was murdered because her instructors found no value in her fat life. The abuse did not start and end with Gina's collapse or with the instructors' negligence. The abuse began with the idea that Gina ever needed to be punished for her weight in the first place. It could be argued that Gina was not originally at the camp for her fatness, but was instead there to correct her bad behavior. But so much of the behavior being read as bad is structured by her fatness. At the nucleus of her punishment was a push for weight loss as discipline and health and wellness as ways to correct or fix bad or broken behavior. It is also what led to her death. She was neglected, at least in part because she was fat. The nearly 3-mile run she was forced to do, the idea that she was faking what would be her own death to avoid exercise, the fact that her instructors left her to lie in the sun while they drank sodas, a beverage people have long shamed fat folks for drinking, were all a targeted response to her fatness, and it killed her. She was murdered by a culture designed to punish fat people at the behest of health itself. I'll jump to chapter 5 because I know that we have to wrap up for me in a bit. In March 2004, during a news conference with widespread coverage, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, published a report that claimed that obesity was killing 400,000 Americans a year, and that it was becoming America's #1 preventable death, surpassing tobacco. The CDC defines obesity as weight that is higher than what is considered as a healthy weight for a given height. Body mass index, or BMI, is used as a screening tool to determine who is and is not obese. The report was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, which, at least at the time, was the most prestigious medical journal in the nation. Since Julie Gerberding, director of the CDC at the time, and other top CDC scientists co-authored this report, it had the credibility it needed for waves of reporters and news outlets to publish it. It would soon lead to egregious and violent headlines across the nation about fat people, fat bodies, and the alarming rate at which they were allegedly dying from obesity. It would also be cited repeatedly by officials, including then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, several members of Congress, and creators of weight loss drugs seeking to draw attention and funding to anti-obesity efforts. From that moment forward, throughout the rest of that year, public officials and other media platforms used that report as evidence that obesity was the greatest threat facing the American people, and as justification for what would eventually become a forceful and strapping diet industrial complex. This was the start of the modern obesity epidemic. There were a few public indictments of the JAMA report, starting with Science magazine in May 2004. In a report of their own, they wrote, "Some researchers, including a few at the CDC, dismissed this prediction, saying the underlying data are weak. They argue that the paper's compatibility with the new anti-obesity theme in government public health pronouncements, rather than sound analysis, propelled it into print. This became, at least on record, the first acknowledgement of an emerging anti-fat theme within government, health, and science institutions." Soon after Science magazine's report, the Wall Street Journal published a story of their own that covered the errors in the study published in JAMA. On November 23rd, 2004, they opened their story with, "America's obesity epidemic may not be as deadly as the government has claimed." Continuing, they wrote that the study inflated the impact of obesity on the annual death toll by tens of thousands due to statistical errors. On April 30th, just a month after the later disputed report was published, Dr. Terry P., who was the Associate Director for Science in the CDC's Office on Smoking and Health, wrote in an email to his colleagues that he was worried that the scientific credibility of the CDC likely could be damaged by the manner in which this paper and valid, credible, and repeated scientific questions about its methodology have been handled. After stating that he had warned 2 of the report's authors, along with another senior scientist, Dr. P wrote, "I would never clear this paper if I had been given the opportunity to provide a formal review." According to J. Eric Oliver, in his book, Fat Politics, The Real Story Behind America's Obesity Epidemic, Dr. P was right to worry. A more intentional look at the method the CDC used to produce these calculations indicated that the numbers were far from accurate. In his book, Oliver says, the CDC researchers did not calculate the 400,000 deaths by checking to see if the weight of each person was a factor in his, her, or their death. Rather, they estimated a figure by comparing the death rates of thin and heavy people using data that were nearly 30 years old. Although heavier people tend to die more frequently than people in mid-range weights, it is by no means clear that their weight is the cause of their higher death rates. It is far more likely that their weight is simply a proxy for other, more important factors, such as diet, exercise, or family medical history. The researchers, however, simply assumed that obesity was the primary cause of death, even though there was no clear scientific rationale for this supposition. And because that is the end of time for me, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deshaun. Before we move into the facilitate Q&A with Dr. Ongiri, I see, Aiden, you have a hand up. I don't know if you have a question. I'm gonna unmute you. Oh, actually, no, looks like the hand is down. Okay, never mind. All right, let's move into the facilitated Q&A. I am going to introduce Dr. Ongiri. All right, introducing Dr. Ongiri. Amy Abugo Ongiri is Professor and Director of Ethnic Studies at the University of Portland. Their book, Spectacular Blackness, The Cultural Politics of the Black Power Movement and the Search for a Black Aesthetic, explores the cultural politics of the Black Power Movement, particularly the Black arts movement's search to define a quote-unquote Black aesthetic. Their research interests include film and media studies, critical ethnic studies, Africana literature and culture, and gender and sexuality studies. Their academic work has been published in College Literature, Journal of African American History, Camera Obscura, Postmodern Culture, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and UNCA, the Journal of Contemporary African Art. Their creative nonfiction has appeared in Black Girl Dangerous, Mother Magazine, Glitter Wolf, Black Lesbian Love Lab, and the Rad Families Anthology. Please join me, round of applause, all the thumbs, all the commotion, in introducing Dr. Ongiri to facilitate our Q&A with Deshaun. Thank you, Dr. Ongiri. We cannot hear you if you're speaking.
Yeah, I was speaking. I was just saying thank you. It's so great to be here. I'm so honored to share space with you, Deshaun, and this brilliant, brilliant work that I think is just a gift to the world. There's like two books I tell people they have to read. This one and Our Prison, Angela Davis's Our Prison's Obsolete. I think these are two books that if you read them, you understand the world, you know, just brilliant work.
That's an honor. Thank you. And I'm really honored to be sharing space with you as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump right into it because I know we have limited time and I have so many questions, honestly. And you lay this out so eloquently in the text where you say, Black liberation is the end goal, and for it to happen, fat liberation must also be part of the goal. Black liberation is the end goal, and for it to happen, fat liberation must also be part of the goal. So can you tell us a little bit more about why fat liberation and Black liberation must be linked, and also then connect it to the question of health equity?
Yeah, so I really value the work that Dr. Sabrina Strings does with Fear in the Black Body, because to me, it makes the clear connection between anti-fatness and anti-Blackness, right? Where she is naming that so much about this ideology, this fat phobia, this anti-fatness that is experienced in the world only happens through the making of the slave, or through the creation of race, the blackening of our being. And so to me, what that names is that there really is no real way to talk about what it means to, there's no way to answer the already tough question of Black liberation or Black freedom without also thinking with it what fat liberation means, right? Because so much about Blackness and fatness are intertwined. And to me, they become coterminous in so many ways. And so, yeah, there's no real way to separate those two things. And so because of that, when thinking about health, right, the very foundation of the medical industry in our country, the very foundation of health as a practice or as a sort of a metric is rooted in slavery, right? Rooted in this need or this desire to hold or to keep Black folks captive. And as that is the case, I don't see a possibility for any sense of freedom. If there is a possibility for liberation for Black folks, I don't see that as a possibility without also thinking about the eradication of anti-fatness and of health as a metric.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes back to the body and liberation through the body, right? And I'm quoting you a lot because your book does such a really brilliant job of bringing all these issues together in such a succinct and eloquent manner. So I'm going to give you a long quote again, and this is from page 35. For as long as there is a Black, there is a subject to be experimented on. Health will always already be inaccessible to the slave. And as this is the case, health as a framework in which no Black person can ever fit. I mean, that's just so profound. It's so disturbingly profound, you know? And I think if you're fat and Black, you've experienced the truth of that. But my question is, really, can you expand on how health as a framework leaves out fat Black people? Because I know we all have if you're fat and Black, you have horror stories about the medical industrial complex. But can you kind of bring your brilliance to telling us more about how health as a framework leaves out fat Black people?
Absolutely. So I actually really wanted to get to that part of the chapter for chapter 5, but it's perfect because it can lead us into that. So with the creation of the BMI, for example, right, we use BMI in almost every iteration of the medical industry today, right? Even at dentist's office, folks are being weighed, right, and their BMI is being checked. Black trans folks are unable to receive gender affirming surgeries if their BMIs or if their BMI is too high, right? Whatever that means by too high. But the creation of the BMI was from a white man, a Belgian mathematician, a statistician, who had no real interest in determining individual health, right? He created a metric to be used to determine a general population's quote unquote health. And what he structured that from, right, what he sort of what he used as a sort of basis for that was French and Scottish white men. I don't know how many of us have seen French or Scottish white men, but most of us don't look like French or Scottish cis white men. we just don't look like them, right? But that was and is the metric that we use to determine who is and is not healthy. And so because that is the case, that to me becomes one staggering, huge example of the ways that Black fat folks are intentionally left out of whatever health is supposed to mean, right? Particularly because this metric, this index that we use, not only is it based off of French and Scottish cis white men, but the man who created this metric, Adolphe Quetelet, was a very open eugenicist, right? Very open white supremacist. And so that to me just is aligned again with what we're witnessing with the transatlantic slave trade and the ways that anti-Blackness and anti-fatness become coherent ideologies in this very parallel sense. And we still experience the ramifications of that violence today through the BMI.
And I'm curious too, like the leaving out also leads to harm. Like,
Right.
can you connect those things? Like,
Yes, it leads to harm in that, right? So, for example, many of us have gone to doctors before where we are having excruciating pain, right? We're experiencing a lot of pain in our bodies. And more often than not, it's chalked up to the need to lose weight, right? Well, if you just lose weight, then you won't have this pain. But the pain is from the fact that your finger has been cut off, right? And that's obviously a very extreme example, but we know intimately what it feels like to have our pain ignored. And that's also a long history in the US and the ways that Black folks have been engaged, right? We know dating back to slavery, the ways that we have been forcibly euthanized, right? Or have been, Black women in particular have been not given medicines to help with childbirth and child labor, right? We know intimately the struggle of being ignored, our pain being ignored. And part of that looks like using the BMI or using health as a barometer at all to determine one's ability to receive care, adequate care, equitable care, thoughtful care within a medical environment. And when you are fat and Black, you're oftentimes left outside of any possibility for that type of care until you are no longer fat and Black. And for many of us, we can't change our size. And for all of us, we cannot change our race, right? And so that then means that we are forever always left outside of the possibility of health and healthcare because it is based on this very anti-Black, anti-fat, white supremacist understanding of the world.
yeah, I don't know too many fat Black people who don't have a story of pain being ignored. My own sister, actually, very tragic story. She had back pain for over a year. She went to the doctor in that period for every month or so. She would go to the doctor and he would say, lose weight. And finally, she went to an emergency room and they asked, who's your oncologist? And she died 2 months later. So they just ignored the fact that she was, and I think this is not, it's very upsetting to me, obviously, but it's not an uncommon story, so that really resonates in terms of the ways in which our pain just is never addressed because we fall out of the metrics of health. I'm going to throw one more long quote at you. It's on page 82. The Black fat is not dying from being obese, nor is the Black dying from drug addiction. The Black fat is dying because of a medical industrial complex committed to seeing fatness, Blackness, and Black fatness as death. They are dying because of a lack of proper resources like housing and employment that would provide them with money, healthcare, and a place to rest their head. So I guess because this stuff is very dark and very painful, especially if you're in a fat Black body. So I guess my question would be then, what could or would seeing fatness, Blackness, and Black fatness as life and vitality look like? Because I honestly can't even imagine it, but I feel like, you have the brilliance to imagine what that might look like. So show us the utopia.
Yeah, so, I don't know that I can imagine it either. And I think that perhaps what's more true and what I am wanting to get at through my work is that for as long as we are beholden to race, class, gender, sexuality, right, as these things that create first and second class citizens, and then the beings who exist outside of those bounds too, then we never experience vitality. We never experience life, right? And so if there is a possibility, and this is why I say that the question of the already hard question of liberation is even harder to answer because we don't want to think about what it means to no longer be Black, fat, queer, trans, right? We feel beholden to these identities and because we've created cultures around them. but these identities are birthed from our oppression, right? They are responses to the oppressive violence of the world in which we live. And so if there is a possibility for vitality, if there is a possibility for life, it is only at the point in which we no longer exist by these titles.
Huh. But yet our cultures have created, I mean, Black culture in particular is a culture of joy, right? So, I mean, will we be giving that up too, or what would that look like?
Well, I think that Black culture is a culture of, I think Black culture being a culture of joy is only a partial truth, right? I think that it's a culture of joy birthed through slavery. I don't think I think that we have found resilience, right? We've found a desire to live, to be joyful, to be happy in the face of slavery, right? Saidiya Hartman wrote a brilliant book titled Scenes of Subjection, which I'm sure you've read. And in that book, for me, that book resonates with me a lot because what she thinks about, and then Patrice Douglas, who is also a really brilliant thinker, what she also thinks about is trying to move away from thinking slavery solely as this malicious thing, right? Where we're now thinking about slavery as an experience where, yeah, there were Black folks who were also finding pleasure, who were finding joy, who were experiencing, romantic relationships and all these things in the midst of a very violent experience that is chattel slavery. And yet and still, the need to destroy slavery should have mattered and needed to matter more than the desire to hold on to the pleasure, the joy, the happiness that we found in the midst of slavery. And so I imagine that if there is, whatever happens on the other side of the destruction of anti-Blackness will come with some sense of joy that's not rooted in identities birthed through our subjugation. And to me, that feels like a much more honorable joy because then it's not tied to our demise.
That is so deep. That is so deep. Because there's part of me that's like, I don't want to give up Beyonce and barbecue or whatever. Not to reduce culture to that, but like, what could be beyond? If we created that out of slavery, what could be beyond? That's a really profound thought. And
yeah.
Very profound.
I don't give a Beyonce either, to be clear.
So, and I'm not sure about time. I haven't been keeping track of time because I've been lost in the conversation. I want to make sure to give a chance for people to ask questions. Are we okay with time? Okay. One more question. I think in public health, many chronic disease prevention interventions zero in on diet and exercise as a strategy towards promoting healthy communities. I mean, that's what we hear all the time, right? So in both chapters 3 and 5, you talk about how diet and exercise are punishments and confinements to discipline fat bodies into a standard of health and beauty centered around white Europeanness. So this is kind of related to the last question, but can you talk about the relationship between fat liberation and abolition? Because I think that's the most profound part of the book, honestly. Like the relationship between fat liberation and abolition. I don't think other people have thought about this.
Yes, this to me, it's important. I think that there is a very clear relationship between fat liberation, disability justice, and abolition, right? And I think that we are experiencing some of the most profound theorizing and organizing around that in the midst of this global pandemic that has also led to so many different types of struggles against the state, right? We have seen so many brilliant disabled and fat folks fighting in various ways against the state. I think a lot about Imani Barbarian, who I adore, who is a brilliant fat Black disabled activist. And her work, along with work with like Maya Mingus and so many other brilliant people, brings me to thinking more deeply about the ways we talk about fat liberation, the ways we talk about abolition, and the ways we talk about disability justice. And I think that if there is a way to talk about fat liberation and abolition, it is through an understanding that abolition is only a start, right? It can only be the place that we start. It cannot be the place that we end, right? Because if these institutions are built not just by ideologies, but also by structures, tearing down the structure doesn't destroy the ideology, right? Destroying a building doesn't destroy the concept that led to the construction of the building. And I think fat liberation thinks deeply about that. I think, or it should think deeply about that. I don't think that it does necessarily, but it should, because fat Black folks in particular, I think have long experienced what it means to exist at the sort of nucleus or the epicenter of what it means to be engaged both as an idea and as a structure, one that must be destroyed and that must be wiped away. And I think at the moment in which we think about that and flip it on its head to become an analysis around anti-fatness as anti-Blackness and abolition, we can think more deeply about an abolitionist future, if there ever is one.
That's incredible. I mean, this is related, and it's a question I know I get a lot, which is around the question of body positivity. Body positivity seems to have made a lot of headway. And whenever I critique body positivity, people are like, "Oh, you hate Lizzo." I love Lizzo, whatever, you know. But like, you say, if love, and this is on page 6, if love of self or others is to play a role at all in any liberatory efforts, it must be a starting point and not an end. And I just think that's the best critique of body positivity. But could you kind of explain why self-love isn't enough?
Yes. I I laugh because I also get a lot of "you hate Lizzos," which is so interesting to me because I adore Lizzo, but
Right.
people don't know how to think about these things outside of Lizzo, I guess. But yeah, self-love cannot be enough in a world wherein people are beaten every single day for the bodies in which they live, right? The flesh in which they live. Self-love, it's inevitable that it is at best fleeting, right? I don't know how we can ask people or demand of people to feel a continued love about what they see in the mirror when everything about who they are is being told every single day that they must be destroyed. And so the moment at which we look at ourselves in the mirror one day and say, actually, I don't really know that I do love what I see, should it mean that we no longer fight towards or fight for fat liberation, right? And I think that that is one of my biggest critiques of self-love, but also of body positivity. Body positivity functions as a thing that says you are valuable as a fat person for as long as you recognize that you cannot always be fat, right? We want you to say that you love who you are in this moment, as long as you are committed to no longer being fat in the end, because you must commit to a thin politic, which is one that is against excess, one that is against abundance, right? One that punishes you for and creates negative connotations around consumption and greed, right? We call people greedy for wanting to eat, for choosing to eat, in a world that produces more than enough food for people to eat, but that keeps it captive so that they can't eat it. And so my argument is that self-love, body positivity, body neutrality, even body justice, even, right, are things that don't think deeply enough about the ramifications of what it means to exist in Black flesh, and also don't consider what it means for those of us who are bad fats, who are not committed to weight loss, who are not committed to dieting, right, who are not committed to these sort of violent structures that we're supposed to be committed to.
Yeah, and one of the things that does bother me about Lizzo, not her, but about the discourse around her, is she's so incredibly attractive. She has a level of beauty that most people just can't achieve.
It's
But then we
gorgeous.
act like she's like a not incredible, very conventionally attractive is what I'm trying to say. And then we're all acting like we have to accept her. Well, of course, like she's beautiful, So I guess I'm saying all that in a confused way to say, like, I found your chapter on the politics of desirability really important and interesting. So I was hoping you could maybe expand on that a little bit about, just ugly, all these things that you pull together.
Yeah, thank you. And the next book will be all about desire. And so there'll be more to read on that, I promise. But in this case, I'll say that there is something deeply political about ugliness, about who is and is not ugly, right? Folks who are Black, dark-skinned, fat, disabled, trans, queer, right? Those who are furthest away from what it means to be white, by and large, right? The standards that determine who is and is not beautiful. And so what I write about in that chapter is essentially that beauty, desire, prettiness are all violent structures that are created with the intent to subdue or subjugate or oppress or marginalize those of us who exist outside of those walls, those confinements. But they also work in a way to confine the people who do fit in them to a particular box as well. And it becomes deeply, it becomes a hugely violent experience the more that we are sort of forced to navigate the structures put in place to overdetermine how ugly people are engaged. And so what I sort of offer with that chapter is just, or what I guess I'm wanting to say with that chapter is that we have to divest from beauty, we have to divest from prettiness, from desire, but we also have to get clear about what Frank B. Wooderson and Jared Sexton call the libidinal economy, or rather what they expand on, which is the libidinal economy, which is to say that what we desire is created almost entirely by this collective unconscious, right? That we are not necessarily determining what we do and don't desire so much as the way that the world is structured helps to condition us into these desires. And what I'm asking folks to do is acknowledge the fact that while that may never fully change in a world that is still structured by anti-Blackness, we can be more aware, and we can work towards making the necessary adjustments to overturn as much as we can these structures that overdetermine our desires. And that to me is what I'm very interested in. And also thinking about desire not solely as the people that you do or do not have sex with, but rather understanding one, that sexuality determines by and large how we are forced to engage and be engaged by the world, which is to say that it always and already excludes asexual people, right? Aromantic people. But also thinking about the fact that who you do and do not have sex with, or who you do or do not want to have sex with also determines who is and is not in positions of power, right? Which then determines who is and is not housed, who is and is not in a food desert versus being able to feed themselves, right? Who is and is not provided with healthcare, who is and is not employed, right? Who then does and does not die. And I think that we have to understand desire as an organizing structure of the world, as something that cannot be divorced from all of who we are and all of how we are engaged and to be engaged in the world.
Thank you. And I know we probably have a lot of questions. This is also, when's that next book gonna be out?
You
Question
know,
you never ask a
working on
writer,
it. We're working on it.
you need to write that fast because I need that book. As
I'm
someone
on that, I promise.
who's always experienced the violence of being ugly, like I need that book. I think a lot of us need that book, you know?
Yes. Yes. And I'm on it, I promise. I'm working on it.
No pressure, but it's very important. Okay,
Thank
so
you.
I think we should turn it over to see if anybody I can see there's questions in the chat. Should I go ahead and read them or? Okay. Yeah, wow. Okay. Being fat and black is going to the doctor and your doctor being fat and white and maybe even larger than you telling you to lose weight. True story. Has happened to me too. That's not my question,
Yeah.
but like black women birthing. Well, actually, when my doctor said it to me, I almost said, bitch, you're fatter than me, which is like real ignorant, but like it's such a common experience. They like black women birthing. I remember how the Williams sisters were treated when they were younger in tennis. They were so strong that people said they were too big, especially Serena, not taking into account that our weight sits differently as well.
Yes.
So that's kind of a comment, but what
Serena has always interested me for that exact reason, right? I think that because she also came out after she had birth about how horrible of a birthing experience she had.
she almost died, right?
Yeah, she almost died, and which is true for a lot of black birthing people or black people who give birth and black women as well. I don't like black birthing people as an identifier, but that's a different conversation. But Serena interests me in that way, particularly because I think folks don't really understand exactly how pervasive and how violent anti-fatness actually is. And so they think that it's just a bunch of fat people over here in the corner just yelling about something that only affects them. But it doesn't only affect us, right? It also affects it affects Black folks by and large, especially other Black folks who perhaps if they were white would only be read solely as muscular, right? This is why I include George Floyd in chapter 4 of my book, because he was not fat, but he was murdered because he was larger, and then his health was used as a justification for his murder. This is the cause behind the adultification of Black kids, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but as I was reading your chapter, that whole thing with Ralph Yarl happened, and you saw that the kid who rang the doorbell to pick up his sibling, you seen that kid, he was skinnier than a minute. The guy said he shot him because he looked outside, this is a quote, and saw a big Black man. That kid was like, maybe weighed 100 pounds at that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that went right to my
don't be
heart.
sorry.
Yeah.
It's a perfect point. It's exactly the reason why Tamir Rice is no longer with us, right? Like, I think so much about his story, and part of it could be because I've worked with his mom before, Samaria Rice, and I value her so much. But I think another part of it is just the fact that I'm always reflecting on the beginning and end of his story, right? Where the bystander calls the 911 responders and says, I think that this is a juvenile with a toy gun. And then officers on the scene can't determine whether or not he's 18 or 21. And then the man who calls into the responders or into the responder at the beginning then tells the officers when he's questioned that he thought that the boy could have been a 20-year-old man, right? So all these different ages around Tamir Rice, aging him in a way that was outrageous to me because he was 12, right? And so I think when Serena Williams in particular has always just interested me because she is, I think, the perfect example, along with George Floyd and so many other people that we can pull on, the perfect example of the ways that anti-fatness does directly affect other Black people too, and why they should be considering that violence not only for themselves, or not only for us, but also for themselves.
And an add-on to that question, a recent paper came out that shows that Black women will experience high mortality during birth, regardless of income. Yes, it's a crisis, actually. When we're talking about health crises, this is a huge one. From the wealthiest to the poorest Black woman, the experience is the same. I'm sure the rates are as high in the trans and non-binary communities.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are trans, who are trans men or trans mass folks, and who are non-binary, who have experienced increasingly violent experiences in the medical industry at large, but particularly in spaces that are thought to be reserved for cis women who are able to give birth. And because of that, I know that the research is not being done, or at least not being done on a level that it should be. But I agree with this person that I know for a fact that those experiences are just as high in our communities because of how violent Blackness is engaged, but then how much more true that is when you are also a woman or when you are trans, right? And so, or when you are trans. So yeah, I think that it is just particularly horrific, and also all these things are so intertwined, and to me feel like very clear reasons for why we should all be thinking about these things together and not trying to separate them in the ways that we do.
Yeah, and the person added in, like the little girl in Massachusetts that was spraying bugs, her white neighbor called 911 and said a little Black woman was acting strange in the neighborhood. I don't know if you heard about that one. But yeah, that was also a very small child. I think they were under the age of 10. And again, the police were called on a woman. So I feel like we just stack in case after case after case that makes the case for the argument that you're doing. But do you have strategies on a more granular level that because we're talking kind of big picture? Is there, I mean, unless we dismantle these structures, I don't know what can happen. But I mean, do you have any resources or advice around like how people can handle health care, like the confrontation with the healthcare system?
Yeah, I think that there are quite a few orgs that are doing some I think important work, some really important work around all of this, right? So there's organizations like Project Heal, which are doing some great work around eating disorders, or which is doing some great work around eating disorders. There's an org called ASDA, which I sit on the board for, and they are also doing some incredible work right now to sort of redefine and redetermine what health at every size actually means, and building an entire, or rather compiling a list of folks that fat people can trust for as much as you can trust a healthcare professional to care for them in their care. There's also an organizing body that I have a lot of respect for called Fat Rose, who does specific work around fat justice, fat liberation, and disability justice and disability liberation, and so, or disabled liberation. And so I think that these are just some tangible orgs that folks can tap into and can learn from, can engage, that I think are doing really important and really incredible work right now. But also, I think that we undervalue the importance of reading, of watching YouTube videos, of listening to podcasts. I think we undervalue the importance of research, and we jump to what it means to get to action, and not so much what it means to sit with the information that we need to sit with. And so I also urge people to, in whatever medium feels best for you, whether it's reading podcasts, YouTube videos, reading transcripts, whatever it might be, right? To find resources that you can use for research purposes. And there are tons of guides out there, reading guides, webinar guides, et cetera, for people to use that really help them sort of ground their analysis before they enter into these spaces. Because so often, yes, unsolicited Patty's Talk Back is a good one that I will co-sign. So often we don't sit and think about the importance of research and actually knowing what it is that we're talking about. For me, I started doing some of the best advocacy for myself in medical spaces when I actually developed the language and the understanding of what it was I was experiencing.
And people are offering other cases that they want to talk about. Someone says the man who shot Ralph Yarl perceived Yarl as being 6 foot tall. In reality, Yarl was 5'8". The distortion of our bodies kills us. Thank God he survived that. Someone else says a young trans man was murdered in San Francisco this week. He was hungry and homeless as well, murdered in front of a Walgreens. And someone is saying, you are both so bomb. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation tonight. Do you two have social media? Can you give your social media?
Yes. One, thank you to everyone who engaged. My social media, I am on Twitter and Instagram at the same name, Dashaun LH, DASHAUN LH. I'm also on TikTok. And I'm also on Patreon. So you can find me all at all of those places. At the link in my bio for all of those places is my link tree, and you can find all things there as well.
I'm on social media. I'm old, so I'm on Facebook, and I'm also on Instagram under my name. So, all right. I think we're nearly out of time, but are there any more questions? I always say as a teacher, there's no bad questions, so don't hesitate. This might be the only chance you get to interact with this brilliant person.
I would like to say, before we look and find any more questions, I would like to say thank you to whoever's in the chat of putting up all these resources that I'm throwing out, because I have just been ringing them off, and I appreciate that you've been able to get them and jot them down. Thank you.
And I think you're right that we need to study. We undervalue the studying and learning. Someone says Rip Banco Brown, which is a name I'm not familiar with, but rest in peace, Banco Brown. There's just so many cases of, I mean, you go through it so brilliantly in the book, but there's so many cases of our, deaths.
Yes.
Kind of stuff.
It's overwhelming. And that chapter is one of my favorite chapters, particularly because I think that it really makes clear the connection between policing Blackness and fatness in a way that I wish I had been able to see more of, but that I have not seen in our movements.
I just got a clarification. Banco Brown was the trans person killed in San Francisco this week.
Thank you for that. I had not heard about that, which doesn't surprise me.
And I think it's really important that we call out these names.
Agreed.
Because people don't remember, but we need to remember. We need to be the holders of that.
I'm gonna hop in here. I see that we have a hand up from Lamara, so I'm gonna unmute you, if that's okay.
Hi, thanks for the unmute. I actually have a question. Well, I'm also super excited, and thank you for everything that everybody shared. Deshaun, I just watched you and Justin, King of Reads, do your video about Chloe. So I'm just like super stoked. But you were talking about like what it would take kind of for like anti-fatness and anti-blackness to kind of, I guess, not exist, right? That would take a lot of, I think society would have to kind of end as we know it, and we'd have to move back into anarchy, personally, for my own belief. But I was wondering if you're familiar with the theory of racelessness and building a raceless society. That's something that's been coming up lately in some of the places I've been reading, but just curious if you've heard about it. If not, that's obviously okay, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are if you are familiar with it, because I kind of get red flags when I hear people talk about it, but.
Yeah, I mean, I have not heard of this. I haven't done any reading on this, so I would love recommendations if you have any. But I will say that my initial thought after hearing theory of racelessness, I'm afraid of what that could mean, particularly because I think that there is no possibility for racelessness in a world that is still constructed by anti-Blackness. And so unless it is about, the destruction of anti-Blackness, I don't know what its utility would be. And also, I don't know anything about this theory or who developed it, so I'm not making any judgments by it per se, but I also think that it sounds fairly white in that, people are pushing for, like quote unquote color blindness. And so I would be very interested in reading more to sort of be able to better determine my thoughts around that. And also shout out to you for listening to me and Justin.
Yes, thank you for answering that. Yeah, it does give me a lot of red flags, a theory. Thank you for putting the information in the chat. Uju, appreciate it. And thank you for answering my question.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the minute we start to organize around race as Black people, then you get this, oh, race doesn't matter, this colorblind ideology. So I also have not heard of that, but I'm kind of suspicious.
Yeah, I'm reading about it now. And I see that the first thing is actually it's trademarked. So theory of racelessness is a place to go to free themselves from racism. A place people go to free themselves from racism, which is an impossibility. So that's my thoughts on that.
Other questions? Because I think we've really you've taken us on a journey tonight, and it's been really profound.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I really cannot wait for that next book. You better
I'm excited about it.
Get to writing right now.
You sound like my agents. They tell me the same thing. I'm very excited about it. I'm looking forward to it. I think that, there's so much to say about desire and desirability and the ways that it structures our world. And I want to talk about it. I want to talk about how it quells revolution. I want to talk about how it structures who and how we date or have sex or don't have sex or whatever. I want to talk about who we befriend and who we don't befriend, right? There is just so much about desire, the libidinal economy, that I think has not been explored through a fat lens that I'm really, really interested in doing.
Yeah, it's been really under theory. I mean, there are great people working on it. I can think of like Caleb Luna. Like, there's people who's really doing, me too, great work on it. But I feel like that deep theorization hasn't completely cohered yet. So I'm really looking forward to your book when it comes out.
Thank you.
And we're getting someone saying, thank you so much. Powerful time together.
Thank you.
All right. Dr. Ngiri, I just want to make sure, because we brainstormed a lot of questions. Are there any other questions you want to ask, or we can move to wrap up?
I think we can move to wrap up. I think we've really covered a lot of terrain.
Sweet. Well, then, thank you all so much. Thank you, Deshaun. Thank you, Dr. Ngiri, for a powerful, amazing conversation. It feels very surreal to be in this moment in this conversation. So thank you both for being a part of this. Thank you for everyone who attended, for asking questions, sharing your thoughts and what struck you during this event. Thank you all to the interpreters, captioners, to the OHEA team for holding it down with timekeeping and the links. Esther, thank you for that. Yeah, just truly grateful for everyone's presence here and the way they showed up. And I'll say two things. One, if you're curious about OHEA, you can check out our website and learn more about us. This is the fourth and last event that we've hosted in our Not a Problem to Be Solved series. And so if you want to learn more and like maybe learn about the next event, please check us out. And then we do have a feedback survey. We love feedback. So if you want to tell us how this event went, we'll drop that link in the chat box. We do encourage you to fill that out to let us know how this landed for you and what you'd like to see from us next time. Anything that I'm missing, Esther, Smiko, Daisy? I'm going to take that silence as a no. All right. So thank you again, Deshaun. Thank you, Dr. Ngiri.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.